Hello and welcome back to another Mikvoto video, the second in 2 days, may I add. So my upload schedule is increasing, which is very good. Anyway, today I shall be talking about the Battle of Agincourt, which was a great victory for the English and a thrashing defeat for the French. Just what we like to hear. And this battle happened on the 25th of October, 1415. Yes, 1415, not 1514, 1415. And it was in a series of battles which accumulated into the 100 Years' War, which was a war that lasted 100 years, would you believe it, between the English and the French. And it's still a bit undecided about who came out on top. But anyway, so the general backstory to this battle is that King Henry V, the current Lancastrian King of England, was campaigning in the north of France with a lovely little tidy army, which consisted of quite a lot of archers, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, King Henry V was in Normandy, having a jolly good time with some modest successes campaigning, but his army was getting quite low on supplies and a bit sick, and he was missing old Blighty. So he wanted to get back to England. And you see, the English occupied Calais, and so if he got his army back to Calais, he could then sail home back to old Blighty. So he came up with a cunning plan to march to Calais. So he went off on his way to march to Calais, and the French got wind of this, as the French usually do get wind of things, and sent off a massive force to stop him. Sadly, Henry V's force was so kind of dwindled and disease-struck that it was a very slow-moving force, while the French force was kind of new and jubilant and was quite encouraged to trap this English force. So on the way to Calais, the English force was quite slow, the French force was quite fast, and the French force eventually got in between Calais and this English force. And so Henry V, in charge of this army of about 8,500 Englishmen, were now trapped in enemy territory, cut off from their own territory and cut off from their route to England. So what would they do? They would hold their ground and defend against the French onslaught. And this onslaught happened on the 25th of October, 1415. And this onslaught happened in a valley. The Valley of Agincourt. There was a thing nearby called Agincourt. But anyway, the battle's called Agincourt. So we're in a valley. Trees on both sides, and there's quite a muddy plain, we'll call kind of muddy. Anyway, so there's trees on both sides of this valley, and there's a plain in between the trees. The French are over here, the English are over here. So the French have a force of 15,000 with 2,400 cavalry knights. It's quite a force to be reckoned with, especially when what you're reckoning it with is 8,500 Englishmen, 7,000 of them being longbowmen, and quite a few thousand of them being Welsh longbowmen. But anyway, we'll give the Welsh some credit for once. So you had the English over here, the French over here, trees on both sides and a valley in between, and it was just going to be a slugging match. And the English, King Henry V, positioned his army like this. He had his main force of 1,500 men-at-arms, so they were your casual knights in armour, not on horses. So they were in the centre, with the longbowmen split in half on each side. And in front of the longbowmen, this is quite a new idea. In fact, I think it might have been one of the first battles it was used in, at least by the English in the 100 Years' War. King Henry V commanded his archers to get wooden stakes and put them in front of the archers so that they'd be defended against any French cavalry charges. And the French had a lot of cavalry. So he had his men-at-arms in the middle, archers on both sides. And now the French lined up in three distinct lines. And I think it went something along the lines of cavalry, men-at-arms, men-at-arms. And the French did have a few archers and crossbowmen, but it's kind of undecided about whether the crossbowmen and the archers were even used in the battle, or whether they just sat there and did nothing, or whether they did one volley at the beginning which didn't really do anything but kind of looked fancy. So it's rather undecisive about what the French firearms kind of corps was doing at the time. And so the battle began with a French cavalry charge. The 2,400 horses with gleaming knights and shining armour charged across this muddy field against the English. The thing was, these were very, very heavy horses, with very heavy knights with very heavy armour, which weighed about 23 to 28 kilograms on them. These were very heavy bodies moving across this field, across this ploughed, I think it was either, there's a few misconceptions here as well, it was either a ploughed field or there had been lots of rain, but it was a muddy field, so these horses ploughed across it straight up to the English. But the thing was, they couldn't outflank the archers, they couldn't outflank the men-at-arms because of the forest, which was on either side. And of course, you couldn't go straight into the archers because you had stakes there. So they had to go into the men-at-arms. So they kind of channeled into this big, great clump of charging horsemen with arrows pouring down on them. And of course, the supporter of the French, if horribly you were one, would say, but aha! The French knights had very, very thick armour and the arrows couldn't penetrate them. And mostly, there's a bit of skepticism about that as well. But yes, the longbowmen did have trouble piercing the French armour's knights. But I can tell you what those longbowmen didn't have trouble piercing, which was the horses. All that the horses had on them were head protection. So they didn't have any of the rest of their bodies were protected. And with the elevation of the shots of the arrows, they were kind of, exactly right to kill the horses and not the actual knights riding the horses. And if you've got a dead horse that goes down, it kind of creates a stoppage in the mass of charging horses. And so more and more of these horses were going down into the mud, and more of the hooves of the horses were kind of ripping up and glutinizing this mud, until you had this muddy field with all of these horses coming across and dead horses, and especially, again, if the arrow hits the horse and doesn't kill the horse, then you have a frenzied horse that goes out of control, and the knight on top can't do anything to control it. It's like the Indian war elephants. So suddenly you had some of these crazy fanatic horses, and you had dead horses, and you had a muddy field, and you had lots and lots of dead Frenchmen. And so the French cavalry retreated. Some of them ran into the spikes that the English archers had put in front of them. Some of them might have just got into the line, but the general consensus is that French cavalry charge was an absolute disaster, and they retreated across the field with even more arrows pouring into them. And as they came back across the field, they then doubled the muddiness and doubled the chaos. And of course, just as they were coming back across the field, the second line of French men-at-arms were ordered to attack. And so you had a massive mass of a few thousand French men-at-arms coming forwards against a few thousand crazy horsemen. And the collision in between was quite catastrophic, with lots of disorganization and chaos, and the horsemen had honestly no real organization left. It was quite chaotic, and then the movement of feet and the collision churned up the mud in the field even more. So you had an even more muddier field. And of course, now you had a few thousand French men-at-arms walking quite slowly through this muddy field, wearing armour that weighed 23 to 27 kilograms, straight towards the English line. And they had to walk a few hundred yards. It was not fun. And it was slow and slow and slow. And of course, the French men-at-arms armour would have actually been quite effective against the longbowmen, of which several were Welsh, but anyway. So the French were marching along, and eventually they got to the English men-at-arms. And of course, plenty of these Frenchmen had been killed by the English and Welsh longbowmen. So their numbers were dwindling, but they eventually got to the English line. And yet, even though their numbers were dwindling, they far outnumbered the 1,500 men-at-arms that the English had here. And so a melee ensued, with King Henry V at the front of the English line in hand-to-hand combat. And they were fighting. And it got to the point where the French men-at-arms actually started to push the English men-at-arms back a bit. But just at this point, the English longbowmen and the Welsh longbowmen ran out of arrows. And so they dropped their bows and picked up their axes and hatchets, which they had used to create their spikes, and just weapons and swords that were lying around. And suddenly you had the French men-at-arms, the English men-at-arms, and these longbowmen on either side kind of descended in on the flanks of the French men-at-arms. And another thing was, these were longbowmen. They were wearing nimble, quick clothes that they could easily run over the muddy fields and attack the Frenchmen with a lot more vigour and enthusiasm. And these Frenchmen were wearing quite heavy suits of armour, and they were getting slowed down, and then because the longbowmen were coming across, they kind of compiled the Frenchmen into an even more narrower chasm. And so it got to the point where all of the Frenchmen were kind of all packed in, and they were tired, and they were muddy, and they had clay everywhere from the mud, and they could hardly lift their weapons. And so the French came up with the idea to send in the final line of the French men-at-arms, and they charged in to try win the day with the superiority of numbers. But the thing was, when you're in a small area, numbers start to become useless. And so the French, the third final line of the French men-at-arms, which just kind of got piled onto the back, just pushed the middle bit of the French men-at-arms even further into the English. And it was just even more of a slaughter. And this went on for about 3 hours. And it went on and on and on. 3 hours later, the French retreated. Lots of French were taken prisoner. And King Henry V actually did quite a bit of fighting in the front line. He got an axe to the head, which took a chunk out of his crown, which formed his helmet, which is quite epic, I thought. I think King Henry V did quite well in this battle. And he even defended his brother, Duke Humphrey, I think it was, his younger brother, Duke Humphrey. Apparently got wounded in the groin, and he kind of stepped over his brother and defended him off as he was able to be pulled away from the Frenchmen. And King Henry V did survive the battle, and that was the end of it. And now, with the relation to casualties, the French sources claim that there were about 4,000 to 10,000 dead Frenchmen and 1,600 English dead. The English sources claim there were about 15,000, or 1,500, to 11,000 Frenchmen dead, with 100 dead Englishmen. But of course, the English won the day. And I mean, they are English after all. So let's go with the English estimates, shall we? With only 100 dead English and 1,500 to 11,000 dead Frenchmen. So, yeah, lots of dead Frenchmen, not a lot of dead Englishmen. And the French aristocracy also had quite a good thorough cleansing because of that battle. The French in the battle lost 3 dukes, at least 8 counts, a viscount, and an archbishop, all in one battle. I mean, that must be a bit of a record. And so the French army was shattered, retreated. The English army under Henry V got to Calais, sailed back to England, and were welcomed in London as heroes. And it kind of proved the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy in England at the time, and was a new starting point in the 100 Years' War against France. And yeah, that's about it. That's how the English thrashed the French at Agincourt. Always look out for that mud.